Stop sharing and just describe myself. I'm a middle-aged white woman with a graying hair, and it's in a ponytail. I have my virtual PA t-shirt on, and I have a spiral staircase in the back with some plants. Our guest today is Will Freed, and he is here to give us some great information on ableism so we can all learn and move in disability pride together. Will, welcome. If you want to introduce yourself, that would be fabulous.
Yeah, so my name is Will Freed, and I use he, him, his pronouns. A brief image description of myself is that I'm wearing a blue polo shirt with lots of stripes down on all the different sides, and I have a background of light blue walls here as well. I want us to here as well acknowledge in this space for this presentation on ableism that individuals with disabilities can be born with a disability, be acquired a disability by trauma or injury during their life. And during our time together in our discussions through this space, I want us to acknowledge that we need to try to be as inclusive as possible of the cross disability community, which means you can acquire disability by birth and as well as over the time of your life. Just to let you all know, and I appreciate everybody for being here during our time in this space to learn and educate. And there's going to be several times where I will have opportunities for us to engage in discussion in the chat based on certain questions. And thank you all for being here. Thank you. And now I'm going to share my screen to start our presentation. To start. Second. So this presentation is Ableism Will Change Your Minds. And I'll be talking about ableism, a section about ableism, as well as universal design to help us be more inclusive. Just so my background of myself, I'm a co-founder of the Equal Access Advocacy Collective, which is a cross-disability collective that is intersectional, comprising individuals of people with disabilities from different identities, as well as a few allies. I'm also a graduate student in higher education and student affairs master's program at Fort Hays State University in Kansas, along with being a high school, middle school, and rec basketball official in the state of Kansas, which I'm very proud of doing as an individual with a disability. Just the content warning that I'm going to give you all here is that some of this content may be depressing and contain some dark images on here. This presentation is an educational opportunity to understand discrimination and oppression that individuals with disabilities face. So now we're going to start by using the chat feature here to answer one question at a time. The first question is, I'm going to ask you all, how familiar are you with the term ableism? I have developed a scale of 1 to 3. 1 is you've never heard the term. 2 is have you heard it before? And 3, you're someone that experiences ableism. I would like us to take our time to answer the first question in the chat, and I will look at it to read and how familiar individuals are. Thank you. Okay, yeah. So we have a lot of twos and threes. It's a good thing that we're very familiar with this term to understand all as a community and learn how we can all help others experience. The next question that I'll have in the poll here is, how familiar are you with the concept of universal design? You can put a 1 in for never heard the term. 2, have you heard the term? And 3, you're someone that uses this concept. Mhm.
Hey, Will, do you mind if I ask a quick question? I know I'm not
Sure.
using it, but by universal design, do you mean universal design of learning, or is it different?
Like with universal design, like there's the concept more from like which came in architecture, like design, and I'll be going over the 7 principles of that in this context today in the presentation.
Okay, because I've only heard of UDL, universal design of learning, so I wasn't sure if you meant the same thing or not. So
Yeah, thank you for asking. Yep. So we have a lot of twos and yeah, a lot of twos here about and a couple threes. Yep. And we totally need more. Yeah, and actually UDL is actually a concept that came from universal design, which universal design was what started the whole process in architecture, and then it later came to the learning side. It's very similar, but there's different guidelines. So with so in universal design for learning, there's 3 guidelines which are mentioned, which are called multiple means of representation, which is basically like how someone utilizes a presentation in a couple different formats. And then you have multiple means of engagement and multiple ways of action and expression. It's sort of 3 versus of 7, just to clarify. And and thank you for the audience for clarifying here. I really appreciate that. 1 second. So like before we talk about ableism, the one thing that you always can't talk about before is this idea of ugly laws, which actually occurred in our United States at one point. This was an old law which started in our late 1800s and ended in our 1970s period of our time history. Ugly laws made it illegal for people with disfiguring disabilities to appear in public because of this appearance. During this time period, which ugly laws existed, individuals with disabilities who looked disfigured based on their face or body would be at times be arrested or fined as little as a few cents just for having our appearance and not being allowed to be in the community. And I'll talk about one city's code which actually existed in our time. Second. So the city of Chicago had their own municipal code, which was code 36034, which included an ordinance that stipulated no person who is diseased, maimed, mutilated, or in any way deformed so as to be an unsightly, disgusting, or improper is to be allowed in or on the public ways or other places in the city or shall thereon expose himself to public view under the penalty of not less than $1, no more than $50 for each offense. And this is something that actually did exist, and individuals with disabilities did get kicked out of being outside and even arrested as a result of public exposure, because this was during a time where individuals with disabilities weren't allowed to be inclusive in the community. And I have a picture just to show of an example. So this is like a picture of what someone with an individual who would look disfigured during our time would be taken by police because of the way they look with the size and how they walk and not be valued. And now I'm going to talk and transition us to this idea of ableism. And you can't now talk about ableism without mentioning this one individual named Talia Lewis, who is an abolitionist, advocate, educator, community activist, and lawyer who has been known to work on issues related to disability, racism, especially deaf and prison issues. They're currently one of the few lawyers in our country that have worked on deaf wrong conviction cases, and how our prison system in our country has not been allowed to give communication access towards individuals who are deaf and hard of hearing. And their most recent updated definition about ableism is a system that places value on people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed ideas of normalcy, intelligence, excellence, and productivity. These constructed ideas are deeply rooted in anti-Blackness, eugenics, colonialism, capitalism. This is a form of systemic oppression, leads to people and society determining who is valuable and worthy based on a person's appearance and or ability to satisfactorily reproduce, excel, and behave. You don't have to be disabled to experience ableism. And I'll basically break down just the eugenics part here. Basically, if you go back during our eugenics period, right near World War II, it was a time where society was ableist, where individuals with disabilities would be more gassed by Hitler and his folks due to the survival of the fittest idea. And this is sort of how ableism roots back to our time of eugenics. And a simpler definition, which I talk about ableism, is that non-disabled people have priority over individuals with disabilities in our society of our practices. And as a community, we have to still work, still to this day, 31 years later after the Americans with Disabilities Act has been signed, to work on including our individuals with disabilities to do what they want and be happy in the community. And I will even as well transition to a couple other ideas and examples of different kinds of ableism. The next idea is this idea called internalized ableism. And this is a practice where disabled people internalize their ideas and prejudices of society that see disability as other or somewhat undesirable, as tragic, and as something to be shunned, if not pitied. This turn results in the disabled people loathing themselves and their bodies. And this basically has the idea that as an individual with a disability, you can't do anything and not have any confidence because you're internalized with the stigma of disability. And as a community, we have to work to make sure that individuals with disabilities don't face this internalized idea of oppressing themselves more because they have a disability. Another example is structural ableism, and this is about society not being designed for accessibility for individuals with disabilities in our buildings, practices, and structures that we've created. And some examples of structural ableism, this is physically, a building has a lack of ramps that are being built, or no ramps. There's no elevators in a building, no sidewalks, no push buttons for individuals who need it for access. You're disabling a building by not including physical barriers for individuals to succeed. The part that's disabling these buildings is when you're creating a design of a building. You're not designing the rooms properly to be able to, for people with disabilities who have mobility aids or wheelchairs to navigate. The furniture is not like removable or too heavy to move around. A doorknob is hard to open or too heavy, and elevators are not put in a visible location in a building. And that is something that's hard to difficult, and we have to work with our architects and our building planners to include in the design phases to push accessibility forward. The next thing which I want us to engage here. This is a time where I want us to engage in the chat to understand language that is considered ableist. So one term that I always think about, and I want my colleagues and people in the audience to think about, is this term special needs. During this time, I want us to take time to reflect for a minute or so to type if we think the term special needs is ableist or not in the chat. And like I'm reading just what Marie put in the chat. Yes, to this. In Philly, sidewalks are often not flat, and it's very painful. And also the Pecco hole covers are mostly missing, and I have to be hyper aware so that my cane doesn't get stuck. I really appreciate your point there, Marie, for talking. And yeah, and now just looking through the chat, I want us to think if this term is ableist or not. Yep. Yes. I have civil rights, not special needs. Don't know. Yes, and I still hear it all the time in education. My needs won't be special if things were designed for people like me in mind. Yes, absolutely. Yes, special needs is ableist term. In reality, each person with or without a disability has needs. Therefore, we have human needs. Sometimes it's not intentional. I mean, our needs are specialized currently. Absolutely. Our needs aren't special. We must need them to meet in different ways. And actually the result of the term here, one second, is actually considered ableist. Special needs usually refers to people with learning, intellectual, or developmental disabilities, but can mean any person with a disability, usually a euphemistic phrase to avoid saying disability or disabled. Instead, we have to think about saying disabled person, person with a disability. Another thing that some individuals work on saying is PWD. And even Nick, I appreciate special needs was a transitional term coined by ableists better than early ones, but universal needs is the term that we need. I mean, and definitely that is definitely like especially an important point that we have to, I mean, think about. Like also like a term that I always like using is more access and more inclusive education. Some folks even think about how they use the term differently abled, and I've gotten offensive by individuals saying differently abled. As well as a community, we have to understand to know person first language, where which is where you individuals have a name before their disability. And you would say, like I would say, Will is on the autism spectrum, or that's or identity first language would be a disabled person. It's up to individuals' preferences as well to how they want to put their disability and how they want to say different things. And I really appreciate the engage in the chat here. If anybody wants to reflect and unpack about this term, you're more than welcome to unmute yourself and have anything you want to say, because I wanted to encourage a place of reflection, because I know special needs is a lot to impact. It's a lot to unpack. Yes, and please don't fight us about it if we say prefer a certain way. I am disabled, not differently abled. Differently abled still brings in the authoring language different than what it creates the space of pitting us against a normal. Yep. If we all have to reflect here about us.
Part of my thing, and I feel like this might be an unpopular opinion, but like I feel like that in the context of how things are in today's society, like although I can completely understand how people may not like the term special needs. For me personally, like I feel like that we do have specialized needs in comparison to the rest of the world. And I mean, yeah, like ideally we would like it to be universal, universal sort of we would like there to be a change. We would like there to be more of a acceptance maybe, but like that we're not there yet. So I feel like that thinking about that, I'm not trying to be like negative, but I guess I kind of feel like that in the context of like today's society, like I personally do kind of ascribe to the ideas that we have specialized needs in comparison to others. But I mean, I know that might be unpopular, but that's just my personal opinion. So
and we don't have to use like that term. And I feel like it's as someone who works in disability services in higher education, it's still about individual preference, and not everybody is still educated about what language is still considered harmful to individuals with disabilities. I didn't honestly realize that this term was actually considered ableist until I did more research and looked at the work of Lydia XZ Brown, they them, who actually has a blog about what language is considered ableist. And there's a whole bunch of terms that I didn't even realize that are harmful towards the community. And Aaron even puts, like, when I first became disabled, I could not use that term to describe myself. I used the term handicapable as I became more comfortable with my disability. I now use the term disabled without shame. I definitely experienced internalized ableism, and internalized ableism is something that I've definitely faced myself, and I totally understand, because we have to have confidence, and especially like we're here with Disability Pride PA to celebrate about how we are enjoy having a life with a disability and aren't ashamed about it. And we're here to make the difference for others in the community. And yeah, and it's not using but does someone have something else they wanted to say? Because I saw them mute. Yeah, like I'm just looking in the chat, and I prefer being called by my name before I have my disability. Yep, we have needs that need to be accommodated. And the one term that I definitely like for us to use is more access needs, because access could mean a lot of universal different things. And that's definitely, like, access could be inclusive. It doesn't mean like special access is more a term for norm. And definitely, like, and what Marie put in, when I was music education major at Temple U, the person teaching the students with special needs course was horribly offensive and often used the R word. And I had forgotten about them until you said higher education. I hope there are no longer teaching, because we need more educators who are compassionate and are aware and kind of you, like Will. I really appreciate that. And with what should be universal is accommodating everybody's individual's needs, the needs that themselves aren't universal and won't ever be. That makes us interesting. Yep. And access needs is good. And yeah, and soon, like, we're transitioning to the next point. If you want, like, I'll be talking about universal design, which will help us understand how we can make our communities more inclusive. I'm going to transition to that point of the presentation. Second. So we have this idea which came from architecture called universal design, and this is our concept, which is designed for buildings to feature the needs of everyone's access needs to the front. And this puts accessibility forward of our architecture and building design phases. And here I'll talk about how this history came of universal design. Back during the 1960s, there was a college student at North Carolina State University named Ronald Mace, who studied architecture, and he was someone who had a disability at the time called polio, and he saw that there wasn't a lot of accessibility being at the forefront. And during his work as an architecture designer, Ronald Mace worked during the 1970s before the Americans with Disabilities Act in Section 504 of 1973, which was that government buildings and programs needed to be more accessible. And he worked on creating a building code in North Carolina, which was Greensboro, North Carolina, to make sure that accessibility was at the forefront, and now this is why we have universal design that's built because of his work. And North Carolina State University was also known to have a center called the Center for Universal Design, which worked on projects and technical assistance for universal design in buildings. And there's 7 principles of universal design, which I'm going to talk about. The first one is equity in use and equitable in use. And this is basically how a design is useful and marketable to individuals with diverse abilities. How equitable in use is created, like when a building is created, it's about working to make sure that we can have different individuals come from like different entrances, from being able to drive in or access public transportation. In Berkeley, California, this principle is used very heavily at the Ed Roberts campus, which is a building known to be built by all universal design, so there are no barriers in place. And this is where several disability organizations are housed in Berkeley, California. And how its equitable use is put in place is here that individuals can actually access that building by the subway system out there called the BART, as well as walk in to show that individuals can have access from different communities to get into that building to be universally accessible. The next principle is called flexibility in use. This design basically accommodates a wide range of individual preferences and abilities. So for example, if you're designing a building for wheelchair accessibility, you have to work on making the door buttons accessible for left-handed and right-handed users to understand that they have a preference in what they use, as well as flexibility in use can be created for trainings that are being utilized. And for example, like when you're creating a training, you have to work on making sure that it's available to users who are typers, people who like to chat, as well as have different forms that different individuals can engage. And another thing that I've seen with this principle called flexibility in use is you work on creating desks that are accessible for individuals who need to more stand or sit in a public space, to allow individuals that have different body comfort positions to make sure that they're included in what they need to utilize as well. That helps us be more inclusive and accessible. Yes, it's important for us to include us typers, because typers is a form of communication. We have to have the flexibility, and this is why I've worked on utilizing these universal design principles in this training as well, and presentation, just so individuals can take it away from here. And then the next principle I have here is simple and intuitive use. This is basically to use how it's like when you're designing something, it's easy to understand regardless of the user's experience, knowledge, or current concentration level. So when you're creating a design, a lot of, in order to be universally accessible, it's important to use like simple picture directions and less words so everybody can understand the next steps. And that's important for us to work on, to making sure how you take all the unnecessary steps and not make things as complicated, so we have it accessible for everyone. Perceptible information. This design basically communicates necessary information effectively to the user, regardless of the ambience conditions, and different elements, the way that can be described for instructions. So for example, in order for perceptible information to be utilized with this principle, when you create a sign, you have to make sure that the sign is accessible in font that's enlarged enough for individuals, as well as including Braille for individuals who are blind and visually impaired, so they can understand the sign and how it's percepted as well, because without that, you're not including it that's perceptible for individuals. And one common thing that I have seen with signs that are built with buildings, it's that they don't want to take away the image and not create an accessible, inclusive lettering. And this is something that we still have to work with our communities on, to make sure that our signage stuff is accessible. And one thing that one individual who's one of the top individuals with universal design in higher education, Dr. Cheryl Bergstaller from University of Washington Disability IT group, has a name tag where all the important information with their titles is accessible to all users to read, to understand the important information and who they are, so it can be an inclusive campus with the work that she does. And this is something that I've learned and want to see more with our name tags, as well as working to have our important information like our pronouns as well, and our titles, so we all understand the size and the font of importance. Tolerance for error is basically this one principle that designs minimize hazards and adverse consequences of accidental or unintended actions. And for example, like with a computer system, tolerance for error is utilized to make sure that something can be like clicked back and fixed quickly, and not be caution and just easy to fix. As well as in the plans, you have a lot of hazards and warnings that are accessible and inclusive to make sure that there's not enough fire hazards in a building space. One thing for tolerance for error is have in your design plans what's going to happen during a fire, and put and make sure that your routes are accessible to get out of easily, and not put to the backbone of the planning. At times, the disability community is not always think about in our society. For example, if you look at California, when we have earthquakes in our plans, it's not easy for error out there. Individuals with disabilities are getting their wheelchairs burned and not getting access to all their medical equipment because we're not thinking about the tolerance for error in our planning in that community. The one another principle that we talk about is how can this be made with low and physical effort. This is design can be officially in comfort with the minimum of a fatigue. Just checking the chat here, I just need something. Yep, the Philly Flower chain charged $50 for wheelchair rentals, which is a lot there. But going back to our physical effort, when you go into a building, how can this be not like tiring for an individual in like the design phase? Is in order to be low physical effort with less repetitive actions, you have to think about how is this easy to navigate to get to like the nearest ramp. Is it put in an inclusive, accessible way? Is it the part of the building structure and built around it? And the one thing that I'll reference again is the Ed Roberts campus in Berkeley, California, as part of making their building more inclusive for universal design is that they designed it with a ramp in mind to make it less tiring for individuals with disabilities who need to get up and out in a meaningful time and not be tired by the way. And this is how we can like minimize that and allow less fatigue. Our last principle here is also an important one for size and space approach. With this principle, there's appropriate size and space is provided to reach manipulation regardless of the user's body, mobility, and posture, as well as provide a lot of space for assistive devices or people who need personal assistance, dogs, and especially when you're planning like an event, you have to think about how can this space be used for individuals who have mobility or different size to be included, and create spaces in there that are set aside for them in the planning process to make sure that our spaces are accessible, because you don't include this in our planning phases of an event that you do, you're not going to be inclusive and not going to allow individuals with mobility differences to have that space to be included and comfortable, and you're doing more harm by not universally doing this. And another thing that I talk about with universal design, like in events like this, we always need to be including closed captioning, because closed captioning benefits individuals who are deaf, hard of hearing, have speech impediments, have processing delays, have required a neurological addition that needs things to be accessible and be able to be seen by others. And this is a feature that we have to still include at the forefront in our planning of events. Even like, yeah, Vicky, I even appreciate how comedian Josh Blue did a comedy piece about how long ramps are. So funny. Yep, I appreciate that as well. And some things for us to use universal design in our own communities, we have to work on creating accessibility checklists for events when we plan them. That's an important part because you can't do an event without putting accessibility. Accessibility allows us to be inclusive to all. And there's one group that's called Sins Invalid, which I've included in our resources part here, that likes to utilize this idea called an accessibility committee, where you have individuals who are working on planning all the access needs for that event or program. And common access needs when you work on creating a program and event is having access to closed captioning, sign language interpretation, making sure that your bathrooms are in an accessible location, having accessibility parking available, having bathrooms now that are gender neutral and accessible. And you have to also think about the size of the event to do that. And if you utilize these access committees, ableism is going to be reduced. And I believe that we can't get rid of ableism 100%, but as a community, we can work on making strides to create a more universally designed and accessible committee in all the work that we do individually together in a community. And it's our job as well to call out these ableist microaggressions and ableist jokes that are being said about others in the disability community, because you're not being inclusive if you can't learn about them. We have to continue systematically working in our systems about ableism. And now, like during this time, I want individuals to reflect in the chat or talk about what ableist environments have you been a part of, so we can push for universal design and access for all in our community. You're welcome to speak or type in the chat, depending on the preferences user.
I'd like to talk about, hi, Will. When you're talking about the universal design, one of the things that I've run into is the issue of the materials that are used, like to create the physical surroundings. And I was in a situation where they put in new carpeting, and I was not able to breathe. And I guess, and if you go into like centers for independent living, they have signs and notices not to wear perfume and things like that. And I was not able to breathe in there. And they were not bringing in fans or anything, to aerate it. And one of the discouraging things was that the rest of the staff were getting headaches, but everyone was afraid to say anything. And I, with my disability, felt that I couldn't take the risk of breathing in that kind of air. and actually took myself home uh, to work at home. And there was a big explosion about that. And I even researched and told them what kind of fan to put in there on the weekends, and it was a Thanksgiving holiday, to aerate the office, which they did. They hadn't thought of. They had the wrong fans in there. They didn't have the floor fans. But I think the big issue about ableism is that the public, the people without disability are not educated. Sorry about my dogs. They're not educated about the terminology and the issues, such that when an issue comes up, it's up to us with disability that we're supposed to take care of it. And I would think that there must be a way to educate the general public as part of their background to issues of disability. Also, given the fact that anyone can become disabled, particularly with aging. But I just wanted to point that out, that people don't think about the smells, the air. You were talking about airing, the air in the buildings that the architects were building. So I just wanted to bring that up. I was obnoxious, but that was because I'm in a fairly secure position in the job, but other people would not feel that way if they were in a different position.
Yeah, like Patricia, like I appreciate you mentioning this, and definitely like individuals have to understand that it's our environmental factors that are there that aren't always more inclusive, especially with the fragrances that are being even used, like for our events or spaces or even bathrooms, cause these issues. And one thing that Sins Invalid recommends is working on making the events and practices that they use fragrance free for those allergies as well.
Well, that wasn't an allergy, but yeah, I also found out that in the dorms, when they use pesticides, they don't evacuate those buildings or give notice that people shouldn't be in the rooms or the hallways and I was thinking about persons with disability that might have difficulty breathing and be affected by, when the exterminators go through. And I found that out just by accident. And in other words, we're talking about general policies. That's why I say we need to educate the general public.
Yep.
That is. Oh.
Yep, that is something that we still, need to do with our work. We have to work with our cities, our building designers, our departments in our communities to keep on educating and talk about the language and how our infrastructures aren't as inclusive. But I've just also been just looking in the chat how we have individuals that have basically been told that they couldn't go to college because of a math disability, and putting them out into another educational environment. And even an entire medical complex is inaccessible from public transit, which is not utilizing equity in use of universal design, and even auditory processing, and how we need captioning and typing, and don't give them time to type responses in for presentations. Patricia, did you have anything else there, or?
No, that's fine. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and here, just for us here, I'm just going to go to the next slide here. And here are some resources for you all that talk about ableist words and terms to avoid, as well as the 7 principles of universal design and access suggestions for a public event, which Sins Invalid talks about as well. And even just Aaron put in, I have access to my school's library to get to the elevators as I cannot take the stairs because I have mobility impaired. The library doors are massive and very heavy, and the ADA push button to the library doors has been broken for months. And every time I asked the staff to fix it, they would make up excuse after excuse. And finally, I wrote a letter to the dean about it. Magically, the school fixed it the following week. Don't accept people making you like an inconvenience. And this is one thing, especially with our ableism, and like in our societies, like you mentioned, there, our disability issues don't get fixed until they happen. We have to work on more prevention, and this is why we have to be more inclusive of universal design and not thinking about a long-term fix. It has to be for the sustainability of the work that we do in our individuals and in our community.
I wanted to add one thing. I think the issues that I faced wasn't only because of the disability, but I think there was sexism involved. I often wondered if I had been a white male who had come across with these issues, if I wouldn't have gotten more support and sympathy, because often these issues, they intertwine.
Yes, they do. I mean, honestly, with understanding intersectionality and disability, and this is why there's a framework of disability justice that actually exists, which was created by Sins Invalid to be aware how disability, discrimination, and sexism, ableism, and racism all do intersect in one another, as well as environmental justice too, as well. And here I'm just gonna this is my contact information for anybody that wants to get in touch with me and continue having conversations about ableism and universal design, and how I can help you all develop an accessibility checklist for events. And now I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and it's an open Q&A time now.
Will, can you do me a favor? Can you tell everybody a bit about the your organization, the Equal Access Advocacy
Collective? Yeah. So sure. So during this pandemic, one year ago, I basically started it with another colleague of mine named Jake Goodman, because we wanted to understand about putting disability and intersectionality, especially cross disability awareness, in the same building. And we've created that to basically understand that individuals from cross disability communities and a few allies can come together and actually work on different disability issues. And right now, with the Equal Access Advocacy Collective, we've been working on writing letters to our legislators and calling eventually about ending sub-minimum wage for individuals with disabilities, because since the 1930s, it's been in our policies of the Fair Labor Standards Act of the United States, there's been a section called 14C, which has basically allowed companies to allow individuals with disabilities to be paid below the minimum wage. And that's been part of that, which we've enjoyed doing that. And my passion for the sub-minimum wage issue comes from me being a former intern from APSI, which is the National Disability Organization, which works on supporting the employment first movement and organizing that individuals with disabilities can be put in competitive, integrative employment. And I believe that individuals with disabilities should be allowed to work the jobs at full wage and full benefits in their communities to do what they want. Also, the Equal Access Advocacy Collective has been working on creating some Instagram posts on some different disability topics, such as putting out ableism, and how even writing a post about tokenism, how individuals with disabilities are often being more tokenized and putting at the table because of their disability, and for that representation. And that's something that I have definitely faced throughout my career as well. And I've been able to help others navigate being tokenized as well. Thank you, Vicky.
Well, thank you.
Yep, I'm willing to answer any questions from people during this time too. You can type your chat, like you can type it in the chat, or you can speak, and I'll be happy to answer it. And for the Equal Access Advocacy Collective, I'm going to put our Facebook group in the chat in a second as well, that I have for it.
Will, do you mind if I invite our participants to turn on their camera? So
Sure, of course.
okay, so if you want to turn on your camera, you can now, and you can chat or ask your questions. I want to thank you. That was a very good presentation, and we all have a lot of work to do to understand ableism and to get the information out there to lots of different people.
Right. Can we just do one thing, since we're all opening up? Can we do the raise hand emoji if you can? So that way we're not talking over each other and the ASL interpreter can interpret one conversation. That would be amazing if you can do that.
Yeah, and like I saw that Marissa had a question first in the chat, so I'll start with answering that.
Okay.
Yes, yeah, so Marissa, where is the best place to start with universal design? Marissa, answering that question, I think first we have to read about that 7 principles of universal design. And individuals, especially when you look at universal design, it takes individuals' creativity to understand how to implement those principles of universal design and the kind of spaces that you want to create. You can, especially with universal design, you can work at how you can utilize different forums for discussions, technology, allow different spaces to be more inclusive for access. One thing that I've definitely have learned about utilizing universal design, when you're creating meetings, you have to be able to make it universally inclusive, so individuals with different flexibilities, with disabilities such as mental health, chronic pain, have different comfort levels to be able to be provided and participate in their environments, because you can't talk about accessibility if you can't include different disabilities, as well as I would be looking at more thinking about the term cross disability and neurodivergent communities, and thinking about being inclusive towards individuals who are born with a disability, acquire mental health, have more traumatic brain injuries, have physical disabilities, and think about in the spaces and environments that you create to be the best inclusive experience for all, as well as don't be the only person working on access and inclusion. Develop a team of passion-like individuals who want to go with you and use universal design. You're welcome. Nick, I've actually not like I have given a presentation before for Fort Hays State University, where I go to grad school, on disability history, but I haven't given much work like workshops on universal design. Right now, I'm an intern with University of Missouri St. Louis, where I've been working with the Student Activities Office on increasing event accessibility for students with disabilities, because right now the Student Activities Office at that institution has been having some problems with the best practices of how to include universal design and people with disabilities at the forefront. So this is an exciting project that I'm getting to work on, and enjoying it a lot, because I want individuals to be able to understand how we can think about these principles for working with individuals with disabilities. Does anybody else have any other questions or any other responses?
Lucian.
Hi. So I'm working on a project currently where I am reaching out to a business to address the fact that they are calling themselves accessible, but have not provided any evidence to their accessibility. And I'm wondering, I guess, if you have any advice about how to go about that without seeming, I don't know, like aggressive or because it's coming from a place of concern, but I don't know how to say, like, you need to be accountable for saying that you're going to be doing these things. You know, kind of where I'm going with that, like how to hold them responsible and how to hold them accountable.
Yeah, like what kind of business is it?
It's supposed to be a social space, like a cafe type business where they also hold shows.
Mm-hmm.
So they were talking a lot about like, oh, well, we're going to be changing the space. And I tried to have a sit down meeting with them about what their accessibility should look like as somebody who has mobility issues. And so far they have not sat down and had that conversation with me. So I'm becoming more concerned as they continue to put me off that it is not actually accessible, because as of right now, it's not even accessible by public transportation.
Yeah. Yeah. So the one thing I can tell you as individuals in the disability community, like we definitely face a lot more emotional labor and capitalism that we have to offer, where we're giving stuff without profit being made. And this is definitely just like, you have to think about working with this space for the long term and the sustainability. If you go to the look at the disability justice principles from Sins Invalid, one of the things they talk about is the term principle sustainability, where you have to think about it for the long term. As well as one resource to look in them is the access suggestions for public events, which Sins Invalid, I put as a resource, has talked about in their book called Skin, Tooth, and Bone. They have a second edition which came out in the year of 2019, and it's something that I have utilized a lot with the work that I have done. And I actually have that book right here in front of me. This is a book that I would encourage anybody to get who wants to work with these organizations on increasing resources, especially with event suggestions.
Thank you so much for that. That answers it perfectly. So I really appreciate that.
You're welcome.
Will, who's the author on that book?
It's a collective effort by Sins Invalid, which is a disability justice group, performance and activism. And tonight they are actually going to be having a performance as well online virtually, and they're a very cool and inclusive group.
Awesome.
Ms. Gingrich, like I really appreciate you, just one of my high school teachers, for just putting in the chat how I'm proud of you and the amazing work you're doing. And I'm getting a new classroom, and I plan to take a hard look at accessibility in all ways. We need universal design. And Mark Moser put there'll also be a repeat performance tomorrow afternoon as well. I see individuals as well have questions as well. So what was the order of people who raised it?
Mark.
Yeah, Mark can go ahead and ask.
Hello. Hi, Will. Hello, everyone. What's the best way to teach people who are old school, like maybe from the old school, like your parents or grandparents, that what they're doing in the form of ableism is wrong? for their, especially for their kids.
Mhm. Yeah, like I definitely think you have to call out these the language that is being considered ableist. What that ableist glossary that Lydia Brown created is an incredible resource, and we have to think about using more terms that are more universal, more inclusive, and don't give as harm as much to individuals with disabilities. One thing that we always have to continue to do is that one of the founders of our disability rights movement, Ed Roberts, talked about is that we have to continue as advocates to go out there and change the old attitudes. We have to have that mindset. This is something that I practice and preach and live by every day.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Yep. Who had theirs hand up next?
P.A. Levy?
It's me.
Yes.
I have a suggestion to Lucian about the business. Most likely the city or town where he's located has, or through their Chamber of Commerce, has policies and also for disability accessibility. It sounded like it was a food place, and I'm sure there's a legal policies that apply to the accessibility to their serving people. So I think he needs to check with the city to see what there is, and the Chamber of Commerce to see what the formal policies are for businesses in that town regarding accessibility and disability. Most likely, if they're not accessible, neither are their restrooms. So I think he needs to check that. I don't know if he's still on, but
Yes.
just a suggestion. Yeah. Hi, Lucian. So I think you need to check that. And that will back you up.
Thank you for that suggestion. I really appreciate it.
Yep. And Vicky, just put in the chat later today, you can make sure. And I'll read just what Cody had first. A lot of the old generation is set in their ways. They don't really want to change. At least my parents don't. My mom is more accommodating and understanding, but they don't always ascribe to newer terminology and thought process. My father refuses to acknowledge I'm autistic, so there is that. But I see that Pam was next with their hand, so you can ask your question, Pam.
Hi, Will. I'm so glad to be here today. I'm thrilled. I'm finally able to attend one of your presentations. I want to compliment you on all of your excellent resources. And with your permission, I'd like to let folks know about the ADA National Network, because a lot of the information that you've shared about accessibility and things are things that we can help them think through also. And I've also put several resources in the chat area. So can I just do a quick blurb?
Sure.
Okay, great. First of all, the ADA National Network provides information and training on the Americans with Disabilities Act, and there are 10 centers across the country. I will put this information in the chat, but you can reach your center by calling 1-800-949-4232. And you will be able to get information on accessibility, universal design, and other things. We also have a guide to temporary events because that's usually a huge issue, especially now as the world is opening back up and we're going to start seeing more festivals and different things pop up, like concerts, etc. So I just want to make sure that you know about that resource, and we will be happy to help you implement all of this wonderful stuff Will's told us about today.
Yep, and these ADA centers, they're all regional, and they're great for technical assistance networks and as well. Yep, and I see with Aaron, like, how do you get stakeholders to go above and beyond what the law requires in terms of implementing accessible spaces? This is something that I've definitely worked on. And the one thing that I feel, Aaron, that we have to do is show our passion for why accessibility needs to go above and beyond what our ADA, says. This universal design idea is not completely mandated at all. It is something that when I talk to people that are outside the disability community don't understand at all. You have to show them your passion, as well as there's one author that always comes in this idea from Simon Sinek with The Power of Why. You have to show them your why implementing accessible spaces is important. That's going to help you with your passion to develop a purpose and competence.
Thanks, Will.
You're welcome. Sure.
Hi. I'm autistic, and I actually am, so I'm on both sides of the team. I work in a job where I'm working on a grant that is creating a accessibility checklist for cultural organizations, and a lot of thanks to like the Philadelphia arts community. They've produced so many good materials that we're going to reference and point people to. And I think as far as working with businesses and a lot of things that I've learned while building this checklist and working with a lot of different people, and also listening to the ADA videos and, going out to those regional ADA centers. In this area, the Mid-Atlantic ADA, which has a really great team, is that what can we do to help translate those gateway ADA things, like, if they can't afford captioning yet, getting a transcription, like help them kind of stage their way in, or show them the free and cheap ways to advance their ADA access and above ADA. So like, I think that if we're helpful and help provide answers and help recruit support and show them that like how it can improve their business, that's also important, because we both want to push hard, but we also want to sort of give a hand up, as it were. And it's unfortunate that in a lot of ways it's on us, to do it, but there are more businesses and people within the government that are listening. And so this is an interesting time where I think, we may be the ones we are the ones that should be coming up with the answers and helping. So maybe like write a list of what works for you, find out from your friends what works for them that are free, cheap, and easy. And maybe it's, you teaming up with friends to find like a small grant to help your favorite coffee shop get a better, like entry door, that you can just like grab with your wrist instead of having to turn a knob or something like that. If it's $1,000 that's the barrier, then maybe like, teaming up together and helping that business and showing them what it's like to make it better, may be the answer. So I think community spirit on our part is definitely one of those things. And I am speaking to that from like, yes, I've been really frustrated, and I have been angry, and I have been loud, but I want to make it better for the next generation at this point. So I'm thinking more long-term and less about my immediate happiness and more about how I can make it better for the next generation. So maybe it's my age. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Hey y'all. Janet, you had really awesome points. Also, I agree with Nick. Thank you for doing your work, and thanks everyone for being here. Um, it's interesting you were talking about in the word special needs, and then this book I have from my Temple experience was from the class Teaching Students with Special Needs: A Label-Free Approach, and it's like special needs is like the big anyway. It's not really label-free. But it's from 2011. I don't know. I thought that was interesting. And then my other thing was with the world, quote unquote, during COVID, a lot of companies suddenly were able to have accommodations for people who needed to work from home. And I feel like a lot of people here can maybe, I don't know, have experiences or if they want to share like how that affected their, their work life experience. Because I was finally, silver lining of COVID was I was able to teach music online virtually, and then when the studios opened back up, anyway, long story short, it's been good for me because people are more open to virtual things. Like we're on this talk right now. I don't know if I would have maybe done this 2 years ago because like it's just I feel like I'm trying to, I guess, I don't know if this is really a question, but more of like a shared experience of like how we're all dealing with this reemergence of coming back into a new normal or whatever we're gonna want to call it. As a disabled person. So I don't know. That was my piece. Thanks for listening.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Marie, I will answer your prompt. So am I echoing on your end?
Yes.
I don't know why I'm echoing. That's annoying. Try to plug my
Are you using the phone and the computer?
I'm not. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. I plugged in my headphones and I replugged them back in. I think that worked. So I actually joke that I think I caused COVID because a couple months prior to COVID, I had been complaining to my university that I wanted to attend class remotely because of my disability. I have lupus, and trying to walk to the school like in a blizzard is very stressful when you're mobility impaired. And we had a particularly kind of rough stretch of a couple of weeks 2 years ago, where it was like really icy and it was hard to get to class. So I wanted to attend class remotely, and the school was very against that. And they didn't consider that to be like a legitimate form of attendance. And then not 3 months later, COVID hit and we're all remote, and we've been doing remote successfully for, a year and a half. So I think now, I'm going back to school in the fall, and seemingly everyone wants to just get back in full force in person. And so for me, it's been a little bit stressful knowing that it can be done, but being kind of pushed up against a wall and being told, no, it can't be.
Yeah, and Aaron, one thing, especially with someone that works in disability services in higher education, this is technically like under a flexible attendance accommodation.
Yes.
I mean, like this is because individuals have their own safety, but also if you're attending a class remotely, it still has to be it still has to be accessible, like it's built. I mean, in the classroom, and our faculty have to be able to like understand that, and as well as have like understand what impacts you and what creates your best learning environment so you can get there safely. And your institution has to work on especially planning for when these snow things happen, policies for students with disabilities that are put in the practices, because you're not, as an institution, you're not being inclusive of students with disabilities if you have that snow issue going on and there's inaccessibility to get out of that places. The places that have where individuals with disabilities go to class or live need to be on the plans to be shoveled first to create an accessible no barrier zone.
Thanks, Will.
You're welcome. Yep.
do not see any other hands.
Yep.
Anybody else?
Any other questions?
Yep, like I
Well,
want to
Will?
thank I want to thank everybody for coming today
Yeah.
and engaging during this presentation. I really appreciate you all being here.
Yeah, well, we appreciate you and all your expertise that you bring to the table. And, you know, we certainly have been educated, new awarenesses, and I'm certainly looking into diving into your resources. So thank you so much for sharing your strengths with us in who you are and what you bring to Disability Pride. We appreciate that.
Yeah, really appreciate it.
So, and thanks to all our participants. What a great group today participating in this conversation. We hope to see you later today in some of our events. And tonight we also have a big international disabled comedian event. So don't miss that tonight. The links are in all over social media and at our website as well. So thank you, everyone, and we'll see you soon.